This week's lecture focuses on the movement of water in the ocean. And we'll see that there's two distinct types of these ocean currents that exist: the surface currents and the deep or thermohaline currents. Now first, let's examine the movement of water at the surface of the ocean. Okay, these surface ocean currents are caused, or powered, or driven by wind blowing across the surface of the ocean. And since this only happens right at the top of the ocean, only the water in the mixed layer gets moved by the wind. The water in the pycnocline and the deep water mass will not move as part of these surface currents. Now, if wind blows across the surface of the ocean, friction will drag along with it water molecules in the ocean. But due to the Coriolis effect, the water molecules do not move the same direction as the wind. The Ekman spiral here shows us how water in the ocean moves when wind blows across the surface of the ocean. And this is named after the scientist who first worked out this idea. Now, in a thin imaginary layer of water, right at the ocean surface, say a meter thick, the water molecules will move at a 45-degree angle to the wind. And that's to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the south. Now, this little layer does not actually exist, but it's going to help us to understand what's going on here. Now, once that water right at the very surface starts moving, friction will drag along water molecules beneath it as well. Okay, imagine there's another little thin layer just below that top one. But these deeper water molecules are further deflected by Coriolis and end up moving even further to the right of the wind. Now, this current a little deeper down is also going to be moving a little bit slower than the water just above it. Now, as you look further downwards at deeper little imaginary layers of water, they are also dragged along by friction. But the deeper down you go, the slower the currents move and the further they've been deflected to the right. And in fact, by the time you get down to the bottom of the mixed layer, about 100 meters deep, the water is actually moving in the opposite direction of the wind. Now, it's important to remember that the water itself is not spiraling. It is only moving in straight horizontal lines. Now, how fast it moves and what direction it moves depend on how deep beneath the surface it's found. Here's a little 3D animation of the mixed layer showing how the Ekman spiral gets going. Now, we'd like to know, on average, what direction does water move if wind blows across the surface of the ocean? And to figure this out, we'll simply average the movement of water at different depths from the Ekman spiral. And it turns out that, on average, water moves at a 90-degree angle to the wind. And that's to the right in the northern hemisphere, to the left in the southern hemisphere. Okay, this is known as Ekman transport and will be extremely important in figuring out how surface currents work in the real ocean. Now, to figure out what these surface currents in the real ocean are like, we need to know about the wind blowing across the real ocean. And for this, we simply look at the bottom of the circulation cells in the atmosphere. The tropical regions of the ocean near the equator are in the Hadley cell and therefore experience the trade winds, blowing generally from east to west. While the upper reaches of the ocean, closer to the poles, will be in the Ferrel cell and will get the westerly winds, blowing from the west towards the east. Now, we're going to use this semicircle to approximate the North Pacific Ocean. Okay, with California on the eastern or right-hand side, Japan and Asia on the western or left-hand side, and Alaska up there at the top. Now, you could also think of this as modeling the North Atlantic Ocean basin as well. And in the tropical regions of this ocean basin, near the equator, trade winds are blowing from the northeast towards the southwest. The water at the surface of the ocean in the tropics is dragged along by this wind, gets deflected to the right by Coriolis, and ends up traveling from the east towards the west. Okay, we'll see in a moment why it is not deflected the full 90 degrees of Ekman transport. Now, once this tropical surface water makes it to the western side of the North Pacific Ocean basin, it runs into the landmass of Asia and must be diverted. And since Coriolis is trying to move the water to the right anyway, it's going to make a right-hand turn at the continent and travel towards the poles along Asia and Japan. Once this water makes it past 30 degrees latitude, it is now in the Ferrel cell and will experience the westerly winds. And this will push the surface water from the west back towards the east or California side. As the water reaches the eastern side of the North Pacific Ocean basin, it runs into that North American continent and must be diverted again. And this water ends up traveling along the California coast from Alaska back towards the tropics. And this is going to complete a loop or cycle of water movement known as a geostrophic gyre. Now let's investigate the forces acting on a water molecule going around a geostrophic gyre. And we'll think first about this little water molecule marked with a red dot in the diagram. It's in the tropical region of the ocean basin and is moving from the east to the west in the geostrophic gyre. Now Coriolis will be trying to deflect this moving water molecule to the right according to Ekman transport, and that's represented by the vector or arrow labeled Coriolis effect. Now that means that the water molecule will be pushed by Coriolis towards the middle of the gyre. And in fact, Coriolis is trying to push every water molecule in the gyre towards its middle. This is going to create a mound or pile of water in the middle of the geostrophic gyre. And although it sticks up about 2 meters high, its slope is going to be very gentle. But water molecules do not want to be piled up into this mound. Gravity is going to try and spread it out as flat and level as possible. Now, called the pressure gradient force, this will push the water molecules from the top of the mound in the middle of the gyre towards the edges. And every water molecule moving around the gyre will have this same force. Now, to figure out what the water molecules in the gyre will actually do, we need to add together all the forces acting on it to get the total or net force. Now, it turns out that Coriolis and the pressure gradient perfectly balance each other out. And that is, they have equal strengths and are pointing in opposite directions. So the total or net force acting on a water molecule is 0. And that means the water molecule will keep doing whatever it's already doing, which is going around the geostrophic gyre. And in fact, that perfect balance between the Coriolis and pressure gradient force is referred to as geostrophic balance. Now, you may have noticed in that last figure that the mound of water in the middle of the gyre is not exactly in the center of the ocean basin. Instead, it's offset over towards the west. Now, known as westward intensification, this is caused by the Coriolis effect. Near to the poles, where the Earth's curvature is strongest, the Coriolis effect is very strong, and water moving from the west towards the east at the top of the ocean basin, the red arrows on the right-hand side, will be quickly deflected to the right. However, Near the equator, where Earth's curvature is less pronounced, the Coriolis effect is weaker, and water traveling from the east to the west in the tropics will not be deflected very much to the right at all. Okay? It will not make its right-hand turn until it runs into the Asian landmass. So the eastern side of the geostrophic gyre turns out to be quite large, while the western side is much smaller. Now, in the real ocean today, we find 5 of these geostrophic gyres, and they are all created in exactly the same manner as we just learned for the North Pacific. Now, there's also a gyre in the North Atlantic Ocean that goes the same direction, clockwise, as the one in the North Pacific. But there's also 3 geostrophic gyres in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, that go counterclockwise, because Coriolis goes to the left in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, you should also know about the strongest surface ocean current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And although not technically a geostrophic gyre because it circles a landmass, it flows through the uninterrupted ocean around Antarctica without running into and getting slowed down by any continents. Now also, if you look right at the equator itself, you will notice the equatorial countercurrents flowing the opposite direction as the gyres. Now this is because right at the equator itself, there is almost no wind. The water is not being pushed to the west by the trades, and some of it will backflow to the east as the equatorial countercurrent. Now, because the mound of the water in the middle of our gyres is offset to the west, the currents on the eastern and western sides end up being quite different from one another. Now let's think first about the eastern boundary currents. Okay, each geostrophic gyre has one on its eastern flank. And the example that you should know about is the California Current, found in the North Pacific Gyre. Now, because the eastern side of the geostrophic gyre is quite large, the eastern boundary currents have lots of room to spread out and tend to be quite broad or wide. Now, because they do cover such a large area, they don't need to stick down very far and are relatively shallow. And also because of their large size, they don't have to move very fast and are the slower of these currents. Now, all the eastern boundary currents originate in the polar regions of the ocean and therefore transport cold water from the poles towards the tropics. And the California Current is the first major reason why we here in Southern California have relatively cold ocean water for our location here on Earth. Now, each geostrophic gyre also has a western boundary current over on its western flank. And the example of these that you should know about is the Gulf Stream, found in the North Atlantic Ocean. Because the western side of the geostrophic gyre is relatively small, the western boundary currents are confined to a narrow channel. But to make up for being so narrow, they're going to stick down much deeper and travel much faster than their eastern boundary counterparts. Now, all these western boundary currents originate in the tropical regions of the ocean and therefore transport warm water from the tropics towards the poles. Now, here's a satellite image of the Gulf Stream off the east coast of the United States. And the red and orange colors are the warm waters of that Gulf Stream current. And these waters originated in the tropical regions of the ocean near the Caribbean Sea. And the western boundary current here is transporting the warm water from the tropics towards the poles. Now, this is another way that the Earth tries to even out the local solar energy imbalance and move the excess heat energy from the tropics towards the poles. But these ocean currents don't move quite as much energy as the atmosphere we learned about earlier. Okay, first off, the ocean moves much slower than the atmosphere. And second, the water molecules in the ocean are still liquid, so it only transports sensible heat energy. But for the water molecules to get into the atmosphere, it must evaporate by first warming up and then absorbing the huge latent heat of vaporization energy. So the atmosphere transports both sensible and latent heat energy as well. Now next we'll examine the deep or thermohaline ocean currents. Now, these are considerably more complex than the surface currents, and I have this diagram up here to give you an idea of their complexity. Now these currents are different from the system of surface currents. The deep currents occur throughout the entire ocean, from the surface all the way to the bottom. They're going to move water in the vertical direction, and they are created, or powered or driven, by density changes in ocean water. Now, we learned earlier in the class that most of the ocean is vertically stable and does not want to move up or down. But there are a couple of special small locations in the ocean where it is not density stratified and water can move vertically. And those special places are where the deep or thermohaline ocean currents begin. Now, in order to fully understand how these deep currents work, we need to know about water masses. Now, water mass is a region of the ocean where all the water molecules have about the same properties, namely temperature, salinity, and density. Now, water masses will get their properties when they are exposed to the atmosphere at the surface of the ocean. But once they sink beneath the surface, they're going to retain those same characteristics. Now, in order to figure out how these deep thermohaline currents work, we need to know how the four most important water masses in the Atlantic Ocean get created. Okay, those four masses are numbered on this diagram according to density. And because these currents are so complex, many slightly different diagrams like this one exist. This is simply the one that I like best. Now, the first water mass we want to examine is the densest one that we have in the ocean, called Antarctic bottom water. It is going to originate or get its properties while exposed to the surface of the ocean next to Antarctica. And that's over on the far right or south side of this diagram. Now, at the surface of the southern Atlantic Ocean, next to Antarctica, the ocean water is exposed to the very cold air of the polar cell in the atmosphere. And this will drop the water's temperature down to about negative 1.7 degrees Celsius. And remember that liquid salt water gets denser and denser as it gets colder. Now, that minus 1.7 degrees Celsius is the freezing point of water in the ocean. It's a lower temp than pure water because the ions inhibit the formation of the six-sided ice crystals. Now, once the water does hit that freezing temperature, it will begin to freeze into sea ice. But not all of the ions that were dissolved into that water will fit into the six-sided crystal of solid ice. Those extra ions that don't fit get excluded from the sea ice and leach into the remaining unfrozen liquid water nearby. So this remaining unfrozen liquid water will have a sharp increase in salinity from those extra ions. And the combination of this increased salinity, along with its cold temperature, makes it the densest water we have in the ocean. But this dense Antarctic bottom water is found at the surface of the ocean. So next to Antarctica, the ocean is not density stratified. And this dense water will sink all the way from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean and form a layer in contact with the seafloor called Antarctic bottom water. Now, the second densest water mass in the ocean is called the North Atlantic deep water, and it gets its properties when exposed to the atmosphere in the North Atlantic around Greenland and Iceland. And the process that creates this water mass is exactly the same as I just described for Antarctic bottom water. It cools down to negative 1.7 degrees Celsius, freezes into sea ice, extra ions get excluded and leach out of the sea ice, and that increases the salinity and density of the remaining unfrozen liquid water nearby. This heavy water will sink downwards, almost to the bottom, and forms a layer sitting just above the Antarctic bottom water mass. Now, the North Atlantic deep water is just a little bit warmer and therefore lighter than the Antarctic bottom water because it forms at 65 to 70 degrees latitude, while the Antarctic bottom water is forming closer to the poles at 75 to 80 degrees latitude. Now, the third densest water mass in the ocean is called Mediterranean water, and it gets its properties while exposed to the atmosphere in the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this area is located very close to 30 degrees latitude, where air is sinking. So large amounts of water will evaporate off the Mediterranean Sea. But only water molecules evaporate. Ions do not. So all of the ions get left behind in the remaining liquid water, making it the saltiest major water mass we have in the ocean. But it's still only going to be the third densest because of its very warm temperature. Now, this warm, salty Mediterranean water will flow out the Strait of Gibraltar and into the North Atlantic Ocean, where it sits just above the North Atlantic deep water mass. Now, the last major water mass is going to form in the South Atlantic Ocean, just a little bit further away from Antarctica than we were looking before. Here, the North Atlantic deep water is rising to the surface, simply because there's so much of it. And some of it flows south to Antarctica and ends up forming Antarctic bottom water. But some flows north and then collides with the surface currents of the geostrophic gyre in the mixed layer. The only place for this converging water to go is down, so it sinks to form the Antarctic intermediate water mass, which sits in the South Atlantic Ocean above the North Atlantic deep water and next to the Mediterranean water mass. Now we're able to figure out the basics of how these deep or thermohaline current works. It all starts near the North and South Poles in the Atlantic Ocean around Antarctica and Greenland, Iceland. Sea ice formation here creates heavy water that sinks and flows near the ocean bottom as a cold and salty deep current. This water moves near the bottom from the Atlantic into the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And once in the Indian and Pacific, the water very, very slowly rises upwards over extremely large areas of the ocean. And this risen water then flows back into the Atlantic as warm, shallow surface currents, and now the cycle can begin again. Now, these deep thermohaline currents are also transporting energy from the tropics to the poles to help the Earth even out the local solar energy imbalance. Basically, warm water moves towards the poles in the Atlantic Ocean, where it cools off, makes some sea ice, and the remaining dense liquid water sinks. It then flows along the bottom towards the tropics, where it very slowly over large areas rises back up to the surface. The sunlight warms this water, and it flows back towards the poles where the cycle can begin again. Now notice importantly that the ocean water sinks rapidly in small isolated locations near the poles, but then rises upwards very slowly, but over extremely large areas. Now, wall to water in these near the ocean bottom, animals undergoing respiration released waste products into the water that serve as plant food or nutrients or fertilizer. But down there at the bottom of the ocean, there's no sunlight or plants, so the nutrients build up in this deep water. But if we could somehow get this deep, nutrient-rich water to rise quickly to the surface where there's sunlight for plants, we'll see a huge explosion of marine life. Now, one way to get the nutrient-rich water to rise up to the surface rapidly is through coastal upwelling. Now, imagine a wind blowing along the California coastline from the north or northwest. It will be moving parallel to our coast. But the water in the ocean beneath it will be moved away from the coastline by Coriolis, or Ekman transport. To take its place, colder water from deeper beneath the surface will upwell along the coastline. Now, this is going to give California its colder than expected ocean water, but also provides the nutrients to support the huge amount of marine life along our coastline. Now, the other major way to get deep water with its nutrients up to the surface rapidly is when deep currents run into the side of an island or seamount. Now, the water obviously cannot go through them and gets deflected upwards towards the surface. And this supply of nutrients supports the huge amount of marine life found near islands like Hawaii and Tahiti.